For decades, the Arctic was viewed as Russia's stronghold. Its vast nuclear fleet gave Moscow a clear advantage in navigating northern waters. But in 2025, with the Arctic winter maximum ice cover recorded at its lowest level in history, that dominance faces new pressure from Canada. Ottawa maintains one of the world's larger ice-breaking fleets, with 18 in service, and has begun constructing 2 heavy polar-class icebreakers under the National Shipbuilding Strategy. Canada is now operationalizing sovereignty tools, combining infrastructure upgrades, shipbuilding initiatives, and new legal claims that reshape how the Northwest Passage could function. The quiet buildup began years earlier. Canada's silent buildup in the Arctic. Canada's silent buildup in the Arctic has been defined less by dramatic announcements and more by steady, deliberate investments. For years, these efforts attracted little attention outside Canadian policy circles. On the surface, they looked like small-scale development projects, support for isolated communities, incremental upgrades to supply routes, and modest infrastructure spending in a region that seemed too costly and remote to matter to global trade. But gradually, each step began shaping a more ambitious strategy. By the mid-2020s, the cumulative effect of these measures revealed itself as something much greater than maintenance. A systematic attempt to shift Canada's Arctic position from vulnerability toward capability. The foundation of this effort lay in logistics. Canada's far north faces extreme challenges. Roads are seasonal, air deliveries expensive, and the short summer thaw offers only limited windows for maritime operations. Reliable ports can help overcome those constraints, and here Canada made a pivotal choice. Instead of dispersing investments across multiple speculative sites, Ottawa supported the redevelopment of the Port of Churchill in Manitoba, the country's only existing deepwater Arctic port connected to the national rail network. Managed by the Arctic Gateway Group, a partnership led by Indigenous and community stakeholders, Churchill became the centerpiece of a broader corridor strategy. In 2024, the port's operators signed a Memorandum of Understanding with FedNav, Canada's largest ocean-going, bulk shipping company, to explore extending Churchill's operational season. That initiative tied local development to global commerce, linking relatively small logistical upgrades to the prospect of hosting international shipping as northern waters become more accessible. If port infrastructure created staging points, ships remain the decisive tool. Canada's icebreaker fleet, though already one of the world's larger groups with 18 vessels, had grown outdated and incapable of sustaining heavy polar operations year-round. To address this, Ottawa turned to the National Shipbuilding Strategy. In 2024-2025, contracts were signed for 2 new heavy polar-class icebreakers, with a single ship build valued at around $3.25 billion. $1 of them, Polar Max, began hull work in Helsinki in 2025 as part of the Ice Pact, the trilateral collaboration signed in 2024 between Canada, the United States, and Finland to share expertise and accelerate construction of polar-capable ships. These new vessels will not enter service until the early 2030s, but the political signal is already clear. They represent not only a reinforcement of logistical capacity, but also long-term commitment to Arctic operations. Unlike Russia's vast fleet of nuclear icebreakers, Canada's strength does not lie in matching tonnage. Its approach is to ensure targeted capability in areas where presence delivers sovereignty, particularly along the Northwest Passage. Defense measures accompanied these civilian and logistical projects. Canada did not mimic Russia's habit of staging large-scale Arctic military drills or showcasing bomber flights over polar airspace. Instead, its investments focused on creating a sustained presence through smaller, distributed forces. The Canadian Rangers, made up largely of Indigenous personnel living in the Arctic, were given expanded roles within national defense planning, ensuring that communities themselves were integrated into surveillance and emergency response. That force structure was paired with new surveillance equipment, improved radar coverage, and upgraded communications, enabling Ottawa to coordinate activity across a region larger than most nations. Military improvements in the north rarely produced attention-grabbing headlines, but they had a practical purpose. to develop reliable, everyday capacity that could respond quickly when incidents occurred, whether environmental or geopolitical. Taken together, these steps have altered the balance of expectations in Arctic politics. Ports like Churchill are no longer treated simply as local economic lifelines. They now serve as nodes through which longer shipping seasons can be tested and extended. Icebreakers are no longer solely maintenance assets, but long-term investments designed to reinforce Canadian claims to operational control. Defense initiatives, while modest in scale compared to Russia's sprawling installations, have created a resilient baseline of presence across territory that was once patrolled only sporadically. Rather than equaling or exceeding Russia's Arctic machine, the significance lies in Canada visibly narrowing capability gaps in specific areas: escort operations, search and rescue, and reliable surveillance that directly affect control of the Northwest Passage. One reason the transformation remained underestimated in its early years was that it unfolded through the accumulation of seemingly ordinary measures. When community-based companies announced investment in Churchill, the news was viewed primarily as local development. When Ottawa outlined plans for new polar-class icebreakers, delays and high costs made observers doubt their impact. Yet, as these initiatives matured and linked together, their combined effect became difficult to ignore. Each new training exercise by the Rangers solidified sovereignty in remote regions. Each upgrade to the port hinted at integration into continental and even transoceanic trade. Each icebreaker under construction signaled a future in which Canada could field heavy polar capacity independently. By 2025, this layered buildup reached a point where Russia began to take notice. Moscow no longer saw a passive neighbor to its east, but a country capable of competing in defined spheres of activity. Canada's efforts do not replicate Russia's scale of icebreaking fleets or extensive northern military installations. What they do is build a credible system of infrastructure, shipping, and defense sturdy enough to protect sovereignty and influence maritime traffic through its own Arctic waters. In a region where physical presence often carries as much weight as formal treaties, this represents a meaningful shift. What makes this development more striking is the timing. Ottawa's expanded role has matured just as natural barriers in the north are undergoing rapid change. The ability to operate ports year-round or deploy icebreakers effectively is not simply a matter of hardware. It hinges on whether the ice itself will permit passage and for how long. Environmental shifts are reconfiguring the operating landscape faster than any shipyard schedule or port upgrade can keep up with. And while Canada has prepared infrastructure and fleets to take advantage of such openings, new climate data is now determining how realistic those ambitions truly are. Melting ice and rising stakes. The most decisive factor shaping Canada's Arctic ambitions today isn't simply planning or shipbuilding, it's the rapidly changing environment itself. In March 2025, the National Snow and Ice Data Center recorded the lowest winter maximum in history at 14.33 million square kilometers. In the same year, Environment and Climate Change Canada reported that summer sea ice in northern Canadian waters has been shrinking at a rate of about 7.2% per decade. These numbers show that conditions in the Arctic are shifting faster than policymakers once believed, making some scenarios more feasible and others more dangerous. For decades, the Arctic ice pack acted as a natural shield across the Northwest Passage, keeping it out of reach for all but the most specialized icebreakers. But today, summer ice is thinning earlier, and it reforms much later into the autumn. The result is measurable: seasons with more weeks of open water. Yet this is not a straightforward path toward easy navigation. Scientists caution that mobile multi-year ice, combined with narrow choke points, continues to make transits unpredictable from year to year. For shippers and policymakers alike, the message is mixed. There is far more potential access, but no guarantee of stability. This balance of openings and risks has direct consequences for Canada's strategy. For a long time, discussions about the Northwest Passage were framed in speculation. Investors doubted whether predictable windows would ever materialize. Now, evidence shows that the corridors are opening with regularity, often in the same places across multiple seasons. Even when sea ice persists, thickness levels have dropped, making icebreaker escorts more efficient. The key difference today lies not in assuming the route is ready, but in seeing usable patterns emerge often enough to justify planning. Compared to its historical reputation, the transformation is stark. Until recently, ships attempting the Northwest Passage required both extraordinary luck and heavy logistical support. Routes shifted unexpectedly, often blocking voyages or forcing costly detours. While those obstacles remain in some regions, many are no longer permanent. In recent summers, shipping firms have prepared trial voyages based on consistent observations of thinning ice. For these private actors, climate trend lines have changed perception. What was once written off as impossible now demands serious business calculations. Canada benefits directly from this evolution. An Arctic port or a new generation of icebreakers matters little if surrounding seas remain closed most of the year. But when open water extends into late summer and autumn, these tools gain real value. Churchill's port upgrades become practical trade infrastructure. Escort systems for commercial convoys become viable planning exercises. Importantly, though, this opportunity comes from the same global warming processes that carry heavy costs. The same heat that opens northern sea lanes contributes to fires, floods, and instability elsewhere. For Canada, however, the singular fact is that the Northwest Passage lies within its jurisdiction, giving Ottawa rare leverage in this global climate-driven shift. The changes also ripple through Russia's position. For decades, Moscow's strategy revolved around its northern sea route. That corridor, strengthened by a fleet of nuclear icebreakers, has been its central asset. The length and difficulty of the passage, though, never change. Sanctions and high operating costs add further challenges. Now, as the Northwest Passage emerges as a partial alternative, the calculations of shipping companies begin to shift. For carriers linking Asia and Europe, even the possibility of cutting thousands of nautical miles matters. Where Russia once counted on occupying the only Arctic corridor, it now faces a competitor backed not by ambition alone, but by measurable environmental data. Inside Canada, the implications stretch well beyond high-level geopolitics. Communities across the Northern Territories have relied for generations on irregular resupply. Open water that persists longer into the year means cargo ships can deliver food, fuel, and construction materials more frequently. Costly airlifts remain crucial for emergencies, but maritime resupply, once limited to narrow windows, now shows signs of expansion. This gradual change bolsters Ottawa's argument for heavy investment in infrastructure, from renovated ports to communications upgrades. The government frames these expenditures not as speculative bets, but as essential responses to conditions already visible in data. But more open water does not eliminate risks, it compounds them. Security planners know that each extra navigable week demands a corresponding increase in vigilance. Canadian Coast Guard crews must expect more incidents at sea, ranging from simple distress calls to environmental emergencies. Rangers and naval units face growing responsibilities in territories where frozen seas once reduced activity. Search and rescue becomes harder as commercial traffic grows, and oil spills or accidents in fragile ecosystems pose amplified dangers. For every statistic showing a decline in ice, there is a parallel spike in questions about how to manage the human and environmental risks that come with it. The numbers recorded in 2025 do not appear as anomalies. Rather, they are continuations of a multi-decade pattern. Each successive report with lower volumes of sea ice reinforces the same conclusion. The Arctic is ceasing to function as an unbroken wall. Where nature once enforced sovereignty by default, governments must now enforce it through presence and capability. For Canada, that shift validates decades of investment in shipbuilding and logistics. For Russia, it undermines an advantage built as much on geography and climate as on engineering. The trend lines themselves become geopolitical markers, forcing both states to adapt. For policymakers, these measurements are not abstract. They are evidence to present in international forums, foundations for territorial claims, and justifications in alliance negotiations. Investors, too, treat them as forecasts, markers of when it becomes prudent to spend on trial voyages or contracts. Activists and indigenous organizations, meanwhile, highlight the same statistics as urgent warnings. Melting ice raises questions about ecological resilience, traditional subsistence ways of life, and long-term cultural survival in the North. In this way, the same figure, record low ice cover, serves as justification, alarm, and bargaining chip, depending on who interprets it. The result is a changing Arctic that can no longer be confined to charts or seasonal forecasts. Every square kilometer of melted ice represents both a competitive opportunity and a new environmental concern. For Canada, the strategic impact is sharpened. The Northwest Passage is no longer a cartographic fantasy, but a space where sovereignty, commerce, and climate risk converge. This reinforces Ottawa's decision to continue investing in polar-class vessels and infrastructure, even if full-year navigation remains unlikely. Most experts still caution that the passage will not be reliably open year-round until mid-century. But that warning itself creates urgency, underscoring that states seeking influence have only a limited strategic window to establish control. In 2025, then, Canada's position in the Arctic rests not on speculation, but on measured change. Its plans appear less like distant aspirations and more like practical responses to data that grows more compelling each year. Russia's advantage narrows, commercial interest gathers momentum, and communities in the North glimpse both opportunities and dangers that once seemed remote. What was written off as unreachable now appears tangible enough to reshape how nations think about trade and sovereignty at the top of the world. And it is here that Canada finds itself poised with a singular advantage. The environmental shifts transforming the Arctic place one corridor squarely within its grasp, turning maps once filled with dashed lines and failed expeditions into potential highways of the 21st century. The Northwest Passage, Canada's strategic trump card. The Northwest Passage has emerged as Canada's most consequential strategic advantage in the Arctic. Once dismissed as a theoretical shortcut across frozen seas, it is now being weighed by shipping companies, policymakers, and rival states as a route that could reshape trade flows in the century ahead. The idea is straightforward. If this corridor functions as a viable shipping lane, it could shorten journeys between the Pacific and Atlantic by thousands of nautical miles. The difficulty and the opportunity lies in whether Canada can convert that theory into dependable practice. Geography shows why the passage matters. The current Asia-Europe shipping system relies on distant detours. One path runs south through the Strait of Malacca, across the Indian Ocean, then north through the Suez Canal into the Mediterranean. Another takes vessels east, around the Americas, and through the Panama Canal. Each journey stretches weeks at sea and devours fuel. Arctic alternatives offer competing efficiencies. The Northern Sea route along Russia's coast can shorten some Asia-Europe voyages by up to 40%, while a successful Northwest Passage transit could save several thousand nautical miles compared to either Panama or Suez. For industries where delivery speed translates directly to costs, even partial savings are attractive. The caveat is that these reductions only come when seasonal conditions allow and when Canada can deploy escort support to ensure safe passage. For shipping firms, those advantages are best understood through specific cases. In Manitoba, the port of Churchill illustrates how Canada is anchoring abstract calculations in real-world facilities. Churchill is the country's only deepwater Arctic port connected to the continental railway system, and in 2024, its operators, the Arctic Gateway Group, signed an agreement with FedNav, the nation's largest bulk shipping company, to explore extending its operating season. This partnership links local development to international shipping ambitions, signaling how Arctic ports might evolve from seasonal supply outposts into trade gateways. When paired with icebreaker escorts, facilities like Churchill begin to transform the Northwest Passage from a speculative detour into a managed system. Still, the route comes with substantial challenges. Navigation remains complicated by unpredictable ice movement, shallow choke points, and rapidly changing weather systems. Early projections that the passage could replace existing global arteries underestimate these constraints. In reality, its use hinges on two practical pillars: Canada's ability to provide safe escort through ice and its ability to stage reliable search and rescue and port support along the corridor. Without these, the distance savings remain academic. With them, the waterway begins to look like a functioning maritime option. Canada's investments reflect this understanding. Icebreakers are being modernized to support escorts not just for research or resupply, but for commercial convoys. Training exercises in recent years have tested conv arrangements where cargo vessels move under Canadian escort through pre-surveyed channels. This system does more than break ice. It creates predictability for insurers, shipping executives, and foreign investors who hesitate without proof of operational reliability. Every demonstration convoy adds to the perception that the Northwest Passage is no longer improvised. It is structured, escorted, and regulated according to Canada's standards. This shift is significant when compared to earlier generations of Canadian icebreakers. For decades, these vessels played vital roles in resupplying northern settlements and supporting scientific missions, but lacked the range and capacity for sustained commercial support. The new designs, Polar-class ships under construction, alongside modernized medium icebreakers in service, changed that equation. Built to withstand higher pressures and equipped for multipurpose functions, they allow Ottawa to maintain repeated escort schedules and provide safety services over larger stretches of its Arctic archipelago. For foreign shipping companies, this service layer is the decisive factor. Melting ice alone does not make a safe corridor. Reliable icebreaking, rescue, and communication networks do. Russia's history on the Northern Sea route underscores this point. Moscow relied on its fleet of nuclear icebreakers to guarantee that its corridor remained functional. That ability gave Russia leverage, regardless of seasonal variability. Canada cannot replicate nuclear capacity, but it does not need to. Its strategy focuses on narrower choke points and concentrated operational areas. By aligning fleet resources along the critical legs of the Northwest Passage, it can offer dependable coverage without mirroring Russia's scale. In this way, Canada's escorts project functionality rather than brute force, a model tailored to targeted sovereignty and trade utility. The economic implications extend beyond shipping savings. A viable Northwest Passage reshapes logistics networks worldwide. Supply chains linked to East Asia would calculate delivery changes not only in terms of nautical miles, but in tangible scheduling for ports and industries in Europe and North America. Faster sailings increase competitiveness for resource exports, from Canadian minerals to hydrocarbons, by shaving days from voyages. While these effects remain contingent on escort availability and favorable conditions, they are real enough to attract careful interest from shipping firms, particularly as fuel and time costs weigh heavily on profit margins. Strategically, Canada gains another layer of leverage. International maritime law often turns on the difference between theory and practice. By organizing escorted convoys through waters it defines as internal, Ottawa accumulates evidence that its sovereignty is exercised in fact, not just on paper. This operational control, backed by ports, escorts, and regulations, furnishes a visible demonstration of authority. Each season in which convoys move under Canadian supervision strengthens its claim to regulate the waterway, a position that carries weight in both trade negotiations and diplomatic forums. None of this erases risks. Ice conditions remain volatile, and unfamiliar choke points continue to pose navigation challenges. Even one accident in a confined channel could disrupt entire seasons, just as global shipping was disrupted when the Suez Canal was blocked by a single grounded vessel. But Canada has responded by pacing the growth of traffic through cautious, heavily managed trials. This ensures that initial successes build credibility rather than inflate risk. In effect, Ottawa is willing to trade rapid expansion for sustained confidence, aware that one headline accident could erase years of careful progress. By 2025, this approach has produced a perceptible shift. The Northwest Passage no longer represents only future speculation. It is being showcased as an emerging, controlled system, supported by escort capacity, expanding port infrastructure, and planning designed to minimize risk. For shipping companies, that is enough to justify serious trials. For governments watching from abroad, it signals that Canada is not only preparing for an eventual Arctic opening, it is already putting resources in place to oversee it. The distinction matters, especially when compared with other Arctic actors. Canada's ability to project authority through the Northwest Passage has implications that extend far beyond trade. It also signals a change in the balance of influence across the Arctic itself, where once a single state appeared unchallenged in dictating the terms of northern navigation. By 2025, Ottawa's actions show that sovereignty in practice can reset assumptions. The Northwest Passage is more than a potential shortcut. It is a case study in how environmental shifts, infrastructure, and strategic planning converge to create new geopolitical realities. And the state most directly affected by this development is watching closely, aware that its longtime dominance in the far north may be eroding. Russia's shrinking grip on the north. For most of the late 20th century and well into the post-Soviet era, Russia held a clear edge in the Arctic. Its northern coastline extends thousands of kilometers, and Moscow inherited from the Soviet Union not only a network of Arctic bases, but also the largest icebreaker fleet in the world. Among these were powerful nuclear-powered icebreakers capable of cutting channels through meters of ice, enabling both commercial shipping and military operations in areas other nations simply could not reach. This capability gave Russia a strong claim to leadership in Arctic affairs and underpinned its control of the Northern Sea Route, a corridor stretching from Murmansk in the west to Vladivostok in the east. For decades, Moscow's Arctic posture seemed secure, supported by energy exports and sustained investments in northern infrastructure. By the early 2000s, Russia's Arctic strength was treated as unchallengeable. Military exercises across the Kola Peninsula and archipelagos, such as Novaya Zemlya, projected power. Submarines operated beneath polar ice to demonstrate presence, while investment poured into oil and natural gas fields in northern Siberia. These hydrocarbons became the backbone of Russia's economy, generating export revenue that financed fleet upkeep, base modernization, and new ship construction. For a time, it appeared no other Arctic state could rival Moscow's physical advantages. That picture began shifting after 2014, when Western sanctions struck at the Russian economy following the annexation of Crimea. Restrictions limited Moscow's ability to access Western capital, technology, and insurance, tools critical for launching offshore drilling in the Arctic and upgrading specialized vessels. Exploration projects slowed, and costs rose as Russia tried to replace imports with domestic production. For its icebreaker program, this disruption meant delays in replacing aging ships, with newer nuclear models entering service later than planned. Russia continued to lead in fleet size, but the steady rhythm of modernization faltered. Each delay increased dependence on legacy assets already stretched across wide waters. War in Ukraine, beginning in 2022, compounded these constraints, redirecting vast sums of money and industry toward conventional warfare left fewer resources available for the Arctic. Shipyards were pressured to prioritize naval replacements over specialized polar vessels. Aerospace facilities tasked with surveillance planes reoriented toward combat aircraft. Funding earmarked for radar coverage across the high north slowed, leaving infrastructure projects unfinished or postponed. Operationally, Russia's Arctic footprint remained visible, bases stayed open, and patrols persisted, but pressure mounted on the system that sustained them. What looked formidable on paper was increasingly fragile beneath the surface. Even beyond resource allocation, sanctions reshaped the viability of Russia's Northern Sea Route. International shipping firms, already wary of legal risks and high insurance costs, avoided relying on Moscow's corridor. While technically navigable, the route attracted mostly domestic or Chinese-linked cargo carriers instead of a global client base. Limited traffic reduced anticipated revenue from transit fees, weakening the case for further megaproject investments. Some nuclear-powered icebreakers under construction fell behind schedule, while financing packages had to be renegotiated at higher cost. These setbacks did not erase Russia's presence, but they undercut the projection of invincibility. This is the opening through which Canada's smaller but targeted program has gained ground. Ottawa does not need nuclear-powered giants to counter Moscow. Instead, its strategy emphasizes efficiency across a compact geography. The Canadian Arctic archipelago, though vast, concentrates choke points in a manner Russia's sprawling northern coastline does not. Effective patrols at a limited number of gateways give Canada leverage over its Northwest Passage. With the planned introduction of heavy polar-class icebreakers alongside its existing fleet, Ottawa can sustain operations where it matters most, even with fewer ships. The advantage lies not in sheer numbers, but in focusing resources on specific corridors that carry strategic weight. For Russia, this reality creates a new perception problem. For years, its leaders framed the Arctic as a zone of indisputable dominance. Nuclear icebreakers smashing through sea ice served as symbols of superiority. That image becomes harder to maintain when shipping companies see tested Canadian escorts through the Northwest Passage as a genuine alternative. Investors track Canadian port expansions at Churchill while noting delays in Russia's shipyards. The contrast challenges the old assumption that Moscow's Arctic power is beyond contest. Even without losing ships or closing bases, the sense that Russia stands unrivaled has weakened. The shift does not mean Russia is fading from the Arctic. Moscow still commands the largest icebreaker fleet, maintains significant infrastructure across the high north, and stations forces in locations ranging from Murmansk to Franz Joseph Land. But sustaining that position now requires more effort relative to shrinking resources. Each delay in deploying a new vessel lengthens Russia's reliance on older ships. Each budget stretched toward war expenditures reduces capacity for Arctic development. And each year of sanctions limits access to Western technology essential for efficient extraction and modern navigation systems. To compensate, Moscow has leaned more on partnerships with China, both for financing and for cooperative shipping arrangements. But that reliance cedes some of the independence Russia once guarded so closely. At the operational level, pressure surfaces in smaller but revealing ways. Training rotations for Arctic brigades have been cut, surveillance upgrades lag behind schedule, and submarine fleets face growing maintenance queues. These gaps do not erase core capabilities, but narrow the margins of superiority. Canada, with an approach that emphasizes steady, modest progress, benefits from each visible delay. Ottawa does not match Russian firepower, but gains credibility by demonstrating that its investments are delivering practical tools, longer operating seasons, tested escorts, and strengthening Indigenous-led patrol systems in the north. Momentum has become Russia's greatest vulnerability. Dominance in the Arctic was once reinforced by continuous modernization and a sense of inevitability. Now, that trajectory has stalled, with sanctions set to continue and war costs unlikely to decrease, a cycle of delay risks becoming structural rather than temporary. Each fiscal cycle devoted to southern campaigns postpones replacement of aging icebreakers, and each postponed vessel represents not only technical decay but political embarrassment. Meanwhile, Canada's smaller program moves in the opposite direction. New construction begins, operational partnerships deepen, and every successful season makes its progress more visible. The irony is that Moscow did not anticipate competition from Canada. Strategic analysts expected challenges from the United States or even China in Arctic shipping, not from Ottawa's relatively quiet naval service. Yet by 2025, Canadian icebreakers escorting experimental convoys through the Northwest Passage highlight precisely that scenario. Russia's large-scale assets still exist, but they no longer monopolize northern narratives. Instead, Moscow faces the symbolic challenge of acknowledging Canada as a competitor in an arena where Moscow once presumed uncontested control. This does not strip Russia of dominance outright. Its nuclear fleet remains unmatched, and the geographic breadth of its coast ensures it will continue to play a leading role. But the combination of external pressure, economic strain, and redirected defense spending ensures that its Arctic position is no longer absolute. Canada's steady rise does not dislodge Russia everywhere, but it introduces competition at choke points where competition matters most. The consequence extends well beyond trade. When operational advantage translates into credibility, global forums and negotiations follow suit. Nations once resigned to relying on Russia's Northern Sea route now weigh the Canadian alternative seriously. That shift changes the diplomatic balance. Where Moscow once commanded discussions of Arctic infrastructure and sea lanes, it now shares the stage. For Canada, this is a strategic gain. For Russia, it is a recalibration forced by external pressures and internal strain. As this new balance emerges, the rivalry is moving beyond the movement of ships. The Arctic has always been as much about law and legitimacy as ice and steel. Canada's growing capacity at sea raises questions about how sovereignty claims are understood and enforced. And it is in this arena, the interpretation of rights, corridors, and boundaries, that Ottawa's strategy is preparing for its next step. Territorial claims redrawn. In 2025, Canada is pressing its Arctic campaign into the legal and diplomatic arena, determined to turn operational progress into sovereignty recognized on paper. For years, one of the sharpest disputes has centered on how the Northwest Passage should be defined. Ottawa insists that the channels through the Canadian Arctic archipelago are internal waters, while the United States and the European Union continue to argue that they constitute an international strait open to all. Make its case, Canada leans on two central tools: its Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act, in place since 1970, and Article 234 of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which grants coastal states special regulatory authority in ice-covered waters. These measures provide a concrete legal basis for Canadian regulations over shipping, a claim that remains contested, but one that gains strength through usage, practice, and demonstration. The arguments themselves are simple in their stakes, but complex in form. If Canada's definition of internal waters were accepted, all transiting vessels would need permission to enter, comply with Canadian environmental standards, and potentially pay fees for services such as escorts or search and rescue coverage. If the Northwest Passage were deemed an international strait, foreign ships could sail through without oversight. For Ottawa, the issue is sovereignty. For its critics, it is about maintaining open seas. The disagreement has simmered for decades, but the timing of Canada's renewed push coincides with expanding seasonal navigability, and that makes the dispute far less abstract. One area where Canada has gained credibility is through active diplomacy. Beyond asserting control over the Northwest Passage itself, Ottawa has pursued tangible settlements elsewhere in the Arctic that showcase its willingness to negotiate boundaries under international law. In 2024, Canada entered into talks with the United States over the long-disputed Beaufort Sea maritime boundary, an issue tied directly to oil and gas potential. Earlier, Canada and Denmark resolved sovereignty over Tartu Paluk, or Hans Island, splitting the tiny rock between Greenland and Nunavut in an agreement hailed as a diplomatic model. Though these examples are distinct from the Northwest Passage, they illustrate that Ottawa's approach to sovereignty is not unilateral. It is based on sustained legal argument and patient negotiation. That posture lends additional weight to its claims. The Arctic Council provides another stage where these efforts take shape in subtle but measured ways. Although the forum is formally aimed at environmental and scientific cooperation, Canada consistently uses the opportunity to demonstrate how it administers its Arctic domain. In 2025, Canadian delegations stressed how their Coast Guard escorts cargo through the passage with environmental standards in place, how Indigenous communities participate in planning, and how Ottawa coordinates responses to emergencies. Even without endorsing sovereignty outright, other council members witness that Canada not only claims the passage, but actively governs it. In international law, practice and administration often carry as much influence as formal declarations, and Canada is quietly building that record season by season. At the United Nations, Canada has also sharpened its technical claims. For years, Canadian scientists have gathered geological data supporting an extension of its continental shelf beyond 200 nautical miles, including overlaps with Russian submissions on features like the Lomonosov Ridge. These seabed claims do not directly decide navigation rights, but they reinforce Canada's broader case by showing thorough research, credible data, and persistence in formal processes. States that appear methodical and evidence-driven in one legal area tend to strengthen their influence in adjacent disputes. For Moscow, already under scrutiny in multiple international forums, Canada's expanded shelf claims pose not only a technical challenge, but a reputational one. Its paperwork now meets convincing competition. The central issue, however, comes back to control in practice. International law, while framed in texts and treaties, gives weight to how states actually behave. Each escorted convoy through the Northwest Passage, each application of environmental law, and each response to an incident at sea or in a northern community reinforces the idea that Canada is administering internal waters. Over time, this accumulation of precedent is difficult for critics to ignore. Russia may object politically, but it cannot project ships through the Canadian archipelago, and the United States may issue diplomatic notes, but it does not escort foreign cargo there. Canada's practical enforcement thus grows stronger the more consistently it is exercised. It is important to note that none of this signals immediate international endorsement. Most states still reflect the long-standing view that the Northwest Passage is an international strait. Canada's legitimacy advances by degree through layers of operation and careful diplomacy rather than sudden breakthroughs. This incremental approach reflects Ottawa's broader Arctic strategy, building credibility step by step until the lines on maps and the patterns of practice align more closely with its interpretation of sovereignty. The consequences of this process are far-reaching. If Canada continues strengthening its position, it could eventually enforce standards on fuel quality, vessel construction, and navigation protocols for every ship passing through. It could levy transit fees that support northern infrastructure and require advanced notification of voyages. Perhaps most importantly, it could deny access outright during crises, using regulatory authority as a geopolitical tool. In a world where Arctic shortcuts are becoming more attractive, that leverage carries enormous economic and diplomatic weight. Russia recognizes the implications clearly. For decades, it expected its Northern Sea route to stand as the premier transarctic passage, fully under Moscow's oversight. Canada's bid to establish similar control across the Northwest Passage introduces a parallel source of authority. Each time Ottawa demonstrates effective administration, it weakens Moscow's claim to Arctic exceptionalism. Moreover, Canada consistently points out that Russia enforces strict regulations and charges fees on its own route, undercutting Russia's argument that the Canadian Passage should remain an ungoverned international corridor. The symmetry of these positions makes Russia's criticism harder to defend. For policymakers in Ottawa, the strategy is to move steadily, building precedent through escorted voyages, technical submissions, and negotiated settlements. Each transport season opens more space to demonstrate practical authority. Each diplomatic resolution with neighbors like the United States or Denmark adds legitimacy. The approach does not require sudden international recognition to be effective. Over time, the accumulation of activity, evidence, and agreement gradually shifts assumptions, making Canada's interpretation harder to dismiss. The framing of territorial claims thus reflects both legal texts and lived realities. As ice retreats and more vessels test the northern waterways, the precedents forged in the 2020s will likely set the boundaries that endure for decades. Climate trends suggest that commercial interest will only rise, reinforcing the importance of decisions made now. Both Canada and Russia understand this timeline. Today's disputes determine tomorrow's frameworks for control. These developments unfold alongside more immediate questions about how Arctic sovereignty affects communities living at the heart of the contested space. While governments debate maritime law in Geneva or New York, the daily reality of governance is felt in settlements scattered across Nunavut and the Northwest Territories. These communities often provide the very personnel who enforce sovereignty, as Canadian rangers, as partners in environmental monitoring, or as voices in local decision-making. Their role highlights that the struggle over sovereignty is not only about shipping corridors, but about people who have long lived in the North and whose futures are bound to how sovereignty is defined. Indigenous communities at the center. For centuries, Indigenous peoples have sustained life across Canada's Arctic. Their knowledge of ice, migration cycles, and survival strategies formed the backbone of existence in a region often described as unlivable by outsiders. Inuit and northern communities developed systems of cooperation, navigation, and subsistence practices that endured through extremes of winter darkness and fragile summers. Yet despite this central role, their perspectives were long ignored in national decisions about sovereignty, development, or shipping. Major projects were discussed in Ottawa or international venues, while communities on the ground often lacked meaningful involvement. Today, as the Northwest Passage shifts from a remote line on maps to a trade corridor drawing global interest, the need to center Indigenous voices has become unavoidable. At the heart of these debates lies a tension between national ambition and local survival. The federal government highlights expanded shipping through Arctic waters as a powerful strategic gain, while Indigenous residents weigh the risks such increases pose to wildlife and traditions that sustain them. Subsistence hunters navigating narwhal migration routes or caribou crossings experience disruptions caused by vessel noise, discharged waters, or changes in ice cover. Timing matters. When a cargo ship transits during a migration season, the disturbance can jeopardize food security for the entire community. These contrasting priorities mean that shipping and sovereignty cannot be pursued in isolation from those who rely directly on the land and sea. For Canada's strategy to stand, Indigenous participation is not simply desirable, it is essential. Until recent years, communities were often consulted late in the process, after key decisions had already been made. Today, Indigenous leaders press for influence at the outset, basing their case on a foundation of legal agreements that recognize land and governance rights. Modern treaties and land claims across Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and other regions create clear frameworks that guarantee participation in resource management. Applying those agreements to shipping means that governments and corporations cannot treat consultation as a procedural formality. Instead, communities expect to co-design routes, establish safeguards, and ensure that benefits reach them directly. A concrete example stands in Manitoba, where the Port of Churchill has become a case study in Indigenous-led participation. The Arctic Gateway Group, a partnership of First Nations and Hudson Bay communities, took ownership of the rail line and port facilities as part of a long-running revival effort. In 2025, the group signed a Memorandum of Understanding with FedNav to explore extending Churchill's shipping season toward year-round use. That agreement represents more than infrastructure. It demonstrates that Indigenous stakeholders can guide Arctic commerce while holding equity stakes in projects. Rather than being passive recipients of federal plans, they are shaping how Arctic shipping evolves in their own backyards. This vision extends into broader governance. In Canada's Arctic foreign policy, Ottawa consistently highlights its commitment to Indigenous partnership, not only domestically, but also in multilateral forums. At the Arctic Council, Indigenous organizations are represented through permanent participants who sit alongside states. Ottawa has increased its funding to ensure these groups have the resources to participate fully at international gatherings. By embedding Indigenous voices directly into the architecture of Arctic diplomacy, Canada underscores that sovereignty in the North must reflect both state authority and the experience of Northern peoples who live the consequences of every policy shift. As this integration grows, so too does recognition that communities are not monolithic. Some welcome economic opportunities tied to expanded shipping, seeing lower prices on imported goods, better access to medicine, or the promise of jobs in port or escort operations. Others emphasize environmental risks, prioritizing food security and the protection of hunting grounds against new maritime threats. These differing preferences underscore that there is no single Indigenous position on Arctic development. Any policy that flattens these voices into one risks repeating the top-down models of the past. Effective cooperation requires space for diversity, acknowledging that each town or community may weigh opportunities and dangers differently. Benefits and risks distribute unevenly. Infrastructure is unlikely to reach every settlement, even as noise, emissions, and disrupted ecosystems affect multiple regions. Communities emphasize that equity must form the basis of Canada's Arctic approach. Some leaders argue for direct revenue sharing from transit fees, ensuring that every voyage through the passage delivers tangible benefits to nearby populations. Others propose community-driven environmental standards that go beyond national regulations. The common thread is clear. Expansion in the north will only have legitimacy if those closest to its impact direct how it unfolds. Without this balance, Arctic shipping risks reproducing the exploitative legacies of the mining and extraction projects that left long-term damage while yielding little local value. At the same time, Indigenous leadership highlights the opportunities of managed cooperation. Expanded shipping seasons reduce costs for resupply and limit dependence on expensive airlifts, bringing down prices on essentials. Icebreakers and Coast Guard patrols improve safety not only for foreign cargo operators, but for hunters traveling on unpredictable ice. New communications and radar systems serve state sovereignty, but also provide lifelines for northern residents who rely on quick coordination during emergencies. With careful frameworks, Arctic shipping can provide resilience and modern connectivity while respecting traditions. This approach builds into Canada's national identity in Arctic policymaking. The expansion of the Canadian Rangers, drawn primarily from Indigenous communities, exemplifies how sovereignty patrols can double as guardians of cultural continuity. National reports increasingly highlight Inuit observations in scientific studies, treating them as data in their own right. Co-management boards review environmental impact assessments with equal representation. And at every level, from local to international, the messaging is consistent. Canada cannot credibly assert sovereignty abroad if it fails to respect Indigenous sovereignty at home. The challenge, though, remains persistent conflict between commercial speed and cultural continuity. Shipping operators assess success by time and profit margins, while communities judge it by ecological health and long-term stability. The federal government attempts to mediate, stressing commitments to sustainability and partnership, yet the friction is unavoidable. Some northern leaders question whether accelerated traffic will ever reconcile with wildlife protection, or whether any safeguards can balance subsistence hunting with shipping expansion. Policymakers argue that frameworks exist to prevent harm, but confidence hinges on whether communities see those safeguards enforced. The debates are not only about inclusion, but about power. Sovereignty in the Arctic is measured by whose rules effectively govern daily life. For Canada, integrating Indigenous communities into shipping oversight strengthens claims in global forums by demonstrating internal legitimacy. But if voices on the ground feel ignored, critics abroad can undermine Canada's sovereignty case by pointing to discontent at home. The endurance of sovereignty, in short, is inseparable from local confidence in how decisions are made. As Canada positions itself to capitalize on the Northwest Passage, Indigenous voices remain a measure of authenticity. Projects led with genuine collaboration help present the passage as Canadian, regulated, inclusive, and managed with respect for ancient traditions. But projects pursued against local preference weaken that narrative, inviting resistance both domestically and abroad. The difference lies not only in consultation, but in shared authority, revenue, and oversight. Canada's decision to fund Indigenous participation in the Arctic Council illustrates that recognition matters internationally just as it matters at home. The reality is that the Northwest Passage cannot be developed on steel and charts alone. Its success as a strategic corridor relies equally on the support of those who depend on northern ecosystems. If economic ambition overtakes cultural survival, expansion risks becoming unsustainable. If instead, Indigenous communities help shape and host this transformation, Canada gains not just legitimacy, but resilience. Yet the deeper issue remains that sovereignty and indigenous partnership unfold in an environment already under strain. Shipping is only one variable. Climate change and fragile ecosystems are another. For communities measuring continuity in thousands of years, the entry of global trade into these waters adds an additional layer of vulnerability. And it is here, where cultural survival meets ecological risk, that Canada's Arctic project enters its most uncertain phase. The environmental gamble. Policymakers may frame the Northwest Passage as a strategic and economic prize, but beneath that calculation lies another reality. The same corridor pushing Canada forward also exposes the Arctic environment to its greatest test. The environmental gamble is that the very activity fueling Canada's geopolitical leverage could simultaneously undermine the fragile ecosystems that strength relies upon. In waters where change happens slowly and recovery even more slowly, mistakes are not short-term, they linger for decades. Of all the risks, oil spills remain the most immediate and devastating. In the Arctic's frigid temperatures, crude oil does not degrade the way it does in temperate seas. Natural processes that break down hydrocarbons elsewhere slow almost to a halt here. That means a spill in narrow or shallow stretches of the Northwest Passage could last for years, coating ice, beaches, and marine life. Seals surfacing along ice ridges, whales navigating open leads, or seabirds that skim the water for food all face direct exposure. Response capacity remains limited despite ongoing improvements. New investments are being made in spill response caches and Coast Guard capabilities, but ice conditions and distance from major supply hubs still impose delays. Realistically, a single tanker accident could overwhelm what Canada can mobilize on short notice. A vivid reminder of this came from past Arctic drilling incidents, when cleanup operations were slowed not just by weather, but by the inability to reach remote accident sites quickly. In the north, geography itself becomes a barrier to effective response. Environmental consequences are not confined to spills. Cargo ships operating on the route fuel another feedback cycle, black carbon emissions. Ships burning heavy fuels emit soot particles that settle on ice and snow, darkening their surfaces. Instead of reflecting sunlight, the ice absorbs more heat, accelerating melt. In polar regions, this effect compounds warming pressures already pushing ice sheets to record lows. Satellite data suggests that summer Arctic sea ice has been declining at roughly 12% per decade relative to the 1980s average. In Canadian northern waters, the rate is nearer 7% per decade. For hunters and communities relying on sea ice stability, these changes are not abstract. They alter migration of caribou, seals, and whales, undercutting cultural practices that depend on consistency in seasonal cycles. The irony is clear. Ships benefit from receding ice while also contributing directly to its further retreat. Noise adds another stress that receives less attention but has real consequences. Heavy vessels generate low-frequency sounds that travel great distances underwater, interfering with the communication of narwhals, belugas, and other marine mammals. These animals rely on sound for navigation, migration, and feeding. Prolonged disruption forces some species to alter routes or abandon critical habitats. For Inuit communities dependent on hunting, the effects ripple outward. Fewer whales and seals available locally translate into reduced food security and deeper reliance on costly imports from the south. What delivers profit to shipping companies in foreign capitals can simultaneously introduce vulnerability in remote Arctic settlements. To counter these risks, Canada has worked to put forward environmental safeguards. Domestic regulations bar the use of heavy fuel oils in sensitive Arctic waters and enforce specialized ship design standards through the Arctic Shipping Pollution Prevention Regulations. At the international level, Canada has championed restrictions within the International Maritime Organization, including the Polar Code, which sets uniform guidelines for ice navigation, and has supported global moves to phase out heavy fuel oil carriage. In 2024, Ottawa took a further step by formally proposing the creation of an Arctic emissions control area, modeled on emission control zones elsewhere, that would require vessels to meet stricter limits on sulfur and particulate pollution. If implemented, This system could directly cut black carbon output from ships transiting the Northwest Passage. These measures demonstrate that Canada is attempting to balance exploitation with stewardship, translating sovereignty into responsibility in practice. But critics counter that the pace of regulation lags behind the pace of traffic. Every year that sea ice declines, more carriers test the corridor. With each new voyage, the likelihood of accidents or emissions grows, yet enforcement capacity remains thin. Radar and satellite tracking have improved Canada's ability to monitor entries into the passage, but enforcement against non-compliant ships, particularly those flagged in jurisdictions with weaker oversight, remains arduous. Even a single poorly maintained vessel attempting the journey without robust safeguards can negate years of diplomatic and environmental effort. The scale of shipping demand amplifies this vulnerability, widening the gap between regulatory ambition and enforcement reality. Thus, the gamble becomes sharper. Each escorted convoy strengthens Canada's sovereignty argument, but simultaneously increases the exposure of northern ecosystems to permanent harm. The very statistics Ottawa uses to show it governs the passage, rising numbers of regulated ships, expanding port activity, well-documented escort operations, function equally as evidence that ecological risk has multiplied. Unlike financial gains, which produce clear quarterly impacts, environmental damage manifests slowly over years or decades when fish populations diminish or migration routes vanish. The challenge for policymakers is that trade negotiations and election horizons reward near-term victories, while environmental accounting punishes long-term neglect. The international dimension heightens the stakes. By presenting itself as a responsible Arctic steward, Canada differentiates its approach from Russia's extractive model. But that image only holds if environmental protections succeed. Western allies who rely on narratives of responsible Arctic powers expect Ottawa to provide proof of compliance and effectiveness. Any major spill or demonstrable loss of Arctic wildlife under Canadian watch would become a diplomatic liability, providing Moscow or Beijing with arguments that Canada's authority is unenforceable or hypocritical. In this sense, environmental outcomes are inseparable from sovereignty outcomes. Canada cannot credibly claim internal control of the Northwest Passage while failing to maintain ecological stability. Local communities are the first to highlight this contradiction. They may benefit modestly from cheaper imports or port jobs, but they endure the direct impact of shifting wildlife, thinning ice, and louder seas. For Inuit leaders, sovereignty cannot be separated from sustainability. When Canada asserts authority over Arctic waters, they argue, it takes on responsibility for environmental safety as well. Indigenous knowledge, integrated into oversight mechanisms, offers practical advantages here. It provides real-time observations of ice conditions and wildlife unavailable through satellite data alone. Combining those insights with modern regulations gives Canada more tools to offset risk, but it does not erase it. Every season of expanded shipping still means taking on heavier responsibility. Canada's environmental gamble is therefore two-sided. On one side is the geopolitical gain, more leverage in sovereignty claims, stronger legal precedent, and competition with Russia. On the other is the ecological cost, from black carbon deposition on sea ice to oil that would linger for decades if spilled into sub-zero waters. Expanded Coast Guard infrastructure helps, proposed emissions zones promise future improvements, and international codes provide a framework. Yet none of these erase the fundamental tension that sovereignty and sustainability must advance together. Failing on one undermines the other. And as global interest in Arctic corridors accelerates, this balance grows even harder to maintain. Each new stakeholder introduces its own incentives and pressures, actors with interests less constrained by Canada's long-term commitments to local communities or environmental stewardship. That reality suggests that Canada's challenge extends beyond managing its rivalry with Russia. Another presence is already shaping routes, investments, and shipping ambitions in the Arctic, one that measures opportunity in geopolitics as much as in trade. China's quiet arrival. While much of the global conversation in 2025 has focused on Canada's rivalry with Russia, another actor has been working steadily in the background: China. Officially, Beijing has no Arctic coastline, but in 2018 it began describing itself as a near-Arctic state. That language, repeatedly used in government white papers and policy documents, asserted that the region's future had direct implications for China's economy and security. 2 years earlier, in 2016, Beijing issued navigation guidance for trans-Arctic passages, signaling its long-term intention to normalize Chinese shipping in northern waters. By 2023, its modernized polar icebreaker, Zhulong 2, undertook Arctic expeditions, strengthening its research capability. These developments underpin a strategy built not on military power, but on commercial, scientific, and regulatory influence. China's motivation stems from vulnerabilities in current global shipping networks. Most Chinese exports leave ports like Shanghai, Ningbo, and Shenzhen, then travel either through the Strait of Malacca and the Suez Canal or across the Pacific and through the Panama Canal. Each of these choke points is costly, congested, and precarious. The Suez Canal closure from one stranded vessel in 2021 showed how fragile the system can be. The Panama Canal, meanwhile, has faced lower water levels linked to drought, reducing the number of vessels it can accommodate. For Beijing, the Northwest Passage represents a hedge against such vulnerabilities. If seasonal openings become more reliable, shipping via Canada could cut thousands of nautical miles off voyages to Europe, reduce reliance on risky canals, and diversify trade exposure. Instead of loudly staking claims, China has mirrored the strategy it has used elsewhere: gradual entrance through commercial trials, research partnerships, and infrastructure investment. Chinese-owned shipping companies have already tested experimental voyages through Arctic waters when ice conditions permitted, carefully publicizing them as proof of capability. Beijing has also pursued cooperative scientific programs with Nordic states, using research as a platform to legitimize its presence. Unlike Russia, which frames the Arctic as domestic space under heavy state control, Chinese rhetoric emphasizes the Arctic as a global commons where all near-Arctic states have a role. By placing itself in this category, Beijing builds a narrative that its participation is natural and legitimate, even if it relies on routes managed by others. Geography makes Canada particularly important to this plan. Compared to the Russian-controlled Northern Sea route, the Northwest Passage offers shorter access to Atlantic markets from East Asia. Moscow's route is burdened by escort fees, permit systems, and the need for costly nuclear icebreaker support. In current conditions of sanctions and strained Russian resources, operational stability looks less attractive. Canada, by contrast, presents a more predictable partner. If Ottawa succeeds in regulating the Northwest Passage under its internal waters claim, Chinese shipping planners see an opportunity: negotiate directly with Canada for access and predictability, bypassing Russian constraints. This pragmatic approach makes Beijing less interested in challenging Canadian control outright and more interested in adapting to it where terms are favorable. For Ottawa, that interest presents both opportunity and risk. Chinese cargo gives Canada new leverage. More ships using Canadian services mean more fees collected, more evidence that sovereignty is exercised in practice, and greater recognition of Canada as a gatekeeper for global trade. Ports like Churchill, modernized with Indigenous and community partnerships, could benefit economically from increased usage, but greater dependence on Chinese shipping volumes brings strategic pressures. If too much traffic comes from Chinese fleets, Canada risks linking its claims to Beijing's logistical priorities. Critics warn that one day Ottawa might face as much negotiation with China over corridor rules as it does with Russia. That concern has real roots in Canada's alliances. The United States, for example, consistently rejects Canada's claim that the Northwest Passage is internal waters, framing it instead as an international strait. Washington also watches Chinese polar expansion carefully, viewing it as an extension of Beijing's global sphere of influence. Canada must balance between welcoming Chinese commerce for revenue and legitimacy, while avoiding steps that strain trust with its closest ally. A miscalibrated policy could signal that Ottawa is enabling Chinese access in ways that undermine NATO's broader strategy. As officials have cautioned, China's commercial interest offers Canada economic gains, but also risks strategic dependency. Ottawa must navigate between maximizing benefits and protecting political alignment with partners. Russia, too, monitors these trends with unease. Chinese presence in the Arctic demonstrates that the region is an emerging trade artery, reinforcing Moscow's argument that northern routes matter. But every Chinese ship choosing Canadian waters over Siberian waters undermines Russia's transit monopoly. Russia seeks to funnel traffic through its northern sea route, collecting fees and maintaining control with its nuclear icebreaker fleet. Watching Beijing explore alternatives creates tension within what otherwise looks like a close strategic partnership. Moscow promotes its Arctic route aggressively in international forums, yet its inability to stop China from engaging Canada reflects the erosion of its perceived dominance. In practice, Beijing's Arctic footprint remains measured. It has not deployed military forces into the Canadian archipelago or established permanent bases. Its activity is concentrated in shipping tests, research stations abroad, and cooperative infrastructure investments. Zhulong 2 voyages are framed as scientific, meant to collect data and map ice conditions. Chinese companies demonstrate ability without challenging Canada's jurisdiction directly. This restraint fits Beijing's strategy: build legitimacy gradually while expanding commercial access, avoiding overt moves that trigger immediate pushback. Its rhetoric consistently emphasizes environmental responsibility and shared governance to broaden acceptance. For Canada, the challenge becomes one of boundaries. Allowing Chinese shipping under Canadian regulations strengthens sovereignty, but opening too much unchecked access risks eroding control. To maintain leverage, Ottawa must enforce permits, escort requirements, and environmental standards firmly enough to remind partners that use of the passage depends on Canadian authority. At the same time, it must reassure allies that accepting Chinese traffic does not signal strategic alignment with Beijing over Washington. Pressures are magnified because Arctic developments are not isolated. They connect to wider debates over technology, trade, and defense. Some Canadian policymakers see opportunity in this arrangement. By regulating Chinese voyages with strict environmental and safety standards, Ottawa can demonstrate both authority and responsibility, reinforcing its sovereignty argument internationally. It can also capture economic benefits while showing NATO partners that Chinese access occurs on Canadian, not Chinese terms. The risk lies in appearing permissive or dependent on Chinese traffic for validation, which could create doubts about Canada's independence in Arctic policymaking. China's quiet arrival, therefore, marks a subtle shift in the Arctic balance, where once the debate centered simply on Moscow's dominance and Canada's rise, now Beijing's economic weight introduces a new dimension. Not through military presence, but through trade volumes, research, and contracts, China shapes expectations of how the Northwest Passage might operate. For Canada, the test is whether it can reap advantages without finding its sovereignty squeezed between competing demands from Beijing, Moscow, and Washington. The effects are already visible in the way Canada approaches Arctic governance. Policymakers emphasize regulatory oversight, coordinate closely with Coast Guard operations, and invest in Indigenous co-management to strengthen legitimacy. Each of these steps is aimed at ensuring that external users, whether Chinese or otherwise, must operate under Canadian terms. Yet the presence of global powers in Canadian waters ensures that Ottawa's decisions resonate beyond its borders and invite scrutiny from both rivals and allies. This is why China's expanding presence, measured though it may be, complicates the broader picture. Canada's sovereignty push cannot be examined in isolation from the expectations of its partners, especially those who question both the internal waters claim and the prudence of welcoming Chinese investment into sensitive corridors. As shipping activity grows, the line between commercial opportunity and strategic vulnerability narrows, creating dilemmas that Canada cannot resolve alone. And it is here, amid these overlapping pressures, that the role of Canada's closest allies comes into focus. What looks like control when measured against Russia and managed carefully with China becomes far more complex once viewed through the expectations of partners who share security commitments but disagree on maritime law. Allies and friction, the US and NATO factor. Canada's Arctic policies acquire a different character when seen not against Russia or China, but through the perspective of its closest allies. The central friction rests on an enduring question in international law: how to define the Northwest Passage. Ottawa maintains that the channels winding through its Arctic archipelago are internal waters, granting Canada full jurisdiction to regulate shipping, enforce environmental laws, and charge fees for services. Washington rejects that view, holding that the Northwest Passage qualifies as an international strait through which vessels have a right of transit without prior Canadian consent. What was once a distant legal debate has gained new weight as thinning ice expands the potential for traffic. The disagreement lingers, but it coexists uneasily with deep military cooperation between the two countries. For Canada, acceptance of its interpretation would mean that every voyage requires compliance with Canadian rules. Ottawa could stipulate icebreaker escorts, apply its Arctic Waters Pollution Prevention Act provisions, and extend fees to shipowners moving through the corridor. For Washington, the concern lies less with Canadian competence than with principle. The United States has long defended unimpeded navigation as fundamental to its global naval strategy. If it accepts Canada's claim in the Arctic, it sets a precedent in other parts of the world where contested straits matter for American operations. Legal officials in Washington worry that any concession might weaken their ability to defend free passage in straits ranging from Hormuz to the South China Sea. This divergence, however, does not translate into open rupture. Rather, it functions as a managed disagreement. Canada and the United States continue to cooperate seamlessly through the North American Aerospace Defense Command, with binational radar, aerial patrols, and regular readiness exercises across the Arctic. NATO commitments reinforce collective defense, and both navies conduct joint operations in high latitudes. At the same time, legal teams from each side continue exchanging memoranda disputing the interpretation of the Northwest Passage. The paradox is that Canada and the US are at once indispensable defense partners and legal adversaries, positions they manage by carefully compartmentalizing cooperation from disagreement. The system of managing rather than resolving the dispute has precedent. A prominent example came in the 1988 Arctic Cooperation Agreement. That accord stipulated that US icebreakers would seek Ottawa's consent before transiting Canada's Arctic waters, but both sides preserved their legal positions. Canada treated the requirement as evidence that its sovereignty applied. Washington viewed it merely as a practical arrangement that did not affect its long-standing legal stance. This kind of selective compromise allowed the Allies to avoid confrontation while preserving alliance unity. It remains a model for how both countries continue to navigate the issue today. NATO complicates the picture further. The alliance does not adjudicate territorial claims, but operational planning requires clarity on authority at sea. Some European allies, especially those with shipping interests, lean toward interpretations of the passage as an international strait to avoid regulatory obstacles. Canada, by contrast, insists that sovereignty and alliance cooperation are not mutually exclusive. Ottawa points to its management of the passage as guaranteeing safe navigation, protecting the environment, and safeguarding human life in waters otherwise marked by unpredictable ice and extreme conditions. Its argument is that regulated sovereignty strengthens NATO by reducing risks, even if legal disputes remain unresolved. This framing has been tested by history. The 1969 voyage of the American oil tanker Manhattan highlighted the tensions. Canada objected, while Washington insisted it did not need permission. The bilateral compromise that followed left the broader issue unsettled but prevented escalation. For decades, periodic U.S. Coast Guard voyages through the passage reminded Ottawa of Washington's position. Canada, in turn, characterized these voyages as operating under a framework of cooperation, not defiance. This careful ambiguity sustained relations for years. Yet as climate trends accelerate seasonal openings and traffic expands, the old flexibility appears less sufficient for the demands of the 2020s. Canada has responded by pairing sovereignty assertions with diplomatic initiatives. In 2024, Ottawa launched formal negotiations with Washington over the Beaufort Sea boundary dispute, aiming to settle overlapping claims tied to hydrocarbon potential. That same year, Canada released its updated Arctic foreign policy, framing sovereignty assertions alongside commitments to Indigenous partnership and environmental stewardship. These steps show that Ottawa is not simply defending old claims, but actively negotiating boundaries and rules with its closest ally, even while disagreements over navigation linger. Meanwhile, the defense dimension ensures that neither side allows the legal dispute to spill into security cooperation. Russian submarines remain active in polar waters, and long-range bomber flights continue probing North American defense zones. Against those threats, Canada and the United States rely on integration too close to risk weakening. NORAD radar grids, joint training missions, and shared technology upgrades demonstrate how alliance imperatives constrain escalation of the legal dispute. Both sides implicitly recognize that Arctic governance cannot erode continental defense. Narrative plays an important role in sustaining the balance. Canada frames itself as a responsible gatekeeper. Regulations in the Northwest Passage are presented not as barriers but as guarantees. Escort services prevent collisions, pollution standards preserve ecosystems, and search and rescue protocols ensure survival in emergencies. Washington may reject Ottawa's interpretation of international law, but allies can accept the tangible benefits that flow from Canadian regulation. That framing reduces pressure for immediate confrontation and buys time for pragmatic compromises to continue. Nonetheless, tensions do surface. Shipowners in Europe express unease that Canadian controls could impose delays or costs on cargo. Some allied governments explore future diplomatic strategies to protect their carriers should Canada's fees grow. In Washington, naval strategists still caution against precedent that could be used against U.S. interests abroad. These cracks remain manageable, but they prove the value of Ottawa's careful messaging. Sovereignty needs to be defended in a way that allies perceive as fair, consistent, and beneficial. The fragile balance could shift if traffic increases more quickly than expected. A surge in voyages would put pressure on Ottawa to enforce its rules more visibly and on Washington to defend its principles more openly. If the managed disagreement were forced into public confrontation, NATO unity could be tested. Allies might face uncomfortable choices: support Canadian regulation at the cost of accepting restriction, or defend free navigation at the cost of undermining Canada's claims. Ottawa's priority is to prevent such stark contrasts by emphasizing that its stewardship aligns with broader alliance goals. The stakes for Canada are high. Its northern claims grow stronger the more it demonstrates practical control, but its defense capacity is deeply dependent on partnership with the United States and NATO. The Arctic cannot be secured by Canada alone. Surveillance, logistics, and deterrence rely on collective structures. This reality keeps Ottawa invested in framing disagreements as manageable differences rather than existential rifts. The pattern is likely to endure: cooperation in defense, dispute in law, and diplomacy aimed at keeping the two tracks from colliding. This managed disagreement matters because if it hardens while traffic expands, it could force allies into awkward public choices between free navigation and Canadian regulation. For Canada, avoiding that moment is essential, not only for sovereignty, but for the credibility of its alliance commitments. That makes the next phase of Arctic policy increasingly important, where national ambition must balance legal, diplomatic, and military demands all at once. And while this friction over sovereignty absorbs so much attention, another force is shaping the Arctic's trajectory. Beneath the disputes over law, defense, and alliance politics lies a more tangible driver that is steadily defining the North's future. It is not just about who patrols the waterways, but about what those waterways are poised to deliver. The economic future of Canada's Arctic. Beyond legal arguments and military balances, Canada's Arctic carries another weight, its role as an emerging economic space. The debate over sovereignty will matter little if the North fails to deliver prosperity. Increasingly, however, the evidence suggests the Arctic is contributing steadily to national growth. Once defined mainly by distance and harsh conditions, it is becoming a space of measurable opportunity. Recent data underscores the broader trend. In 2022, marine trade generated roughly $345 billion for Canada's economy and sustained nearly 30,000 jobs, with ports handling almost 340 million tons of cargo. Though these numbers reflect the national system, they anchor expectations of what expanded northern shipping and resource development could add in the decades ahead. For most of the 20th century, the Arctic remained on the margins of economic life. Communities in Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, and Yukon were small and stretched across immense distances, their economies defined by subsistence activities and reliant on southern supply chains. Much of that reality persists, but investment over the past 20 years has built critical infrastructure that changes economic math in the north. Airports have been lengthened, telecommunications improved, and marine facilities upgraded. Those initiatives, paired with longer shipping seasons, now support rising population and economic activity. By 2025, territorial governments record steady growth in residents where once numbers were stagnant or shrinking. Though absolute increases remain modest, they mark an important reversal of long-running outmigration patterns. Shipping sits at the center of these shifts. Where northern sea lanes once supported only resupply, they now host experimental commercial convoys carrying goods, energy products, and mineral exports. Each escorted voyage through the Northwest Passage creates secondary benefits: port fees, fuel sales, accommodation demand, and local employment tied to logistics. Churchill in northern Manitoba illustrates this development clearly. Its port, operated by the Arctic Gateway Group, a partnership of First Nations and Hudson Bay communities, has become more than a supply hub. In 2025, that partnership signed a memorandum with FedNav, Canada's largest ocean-going shipping firm, to evaluate the feasibility of year-round operations. The project ties local ownership directly to international trade, linking community investment with national strategy. This model differs from earlier eras, when northern infrastructure was designed in southern boardrooms and left communities on the margins. Beneath shipping sits the longer-running pillar of the Arctic economy: resources. Canada's northern territories contain deposits of gold, silver, diamonds, and increasingly valuable rare earth elements. Companies long recognized these reserves, but often struggled to develop them due to high costs, fragile supply chains, and seasonal blockages. Expanded icebreaker support and upgraded infrastructure now reduce some of those constraints. Transportation routes shorten, shipping schedules stabilize, and extraction costs begin to align more closely with southern sites. For critical minerals in demand for renewable energy and modern electronics, this shift is significant. Investors are more willing to consider northern projects when delivery to markets can be planned instead of gambled on seasonal breakups. Energy resources continue to hold potential as well. Offshore oil and natural gas reserves, particularly in the Beaufort Sea, have drawn attention for decades. Exploiting these reserves remains controversial due to ecological risk and high costs, and much exploration has slowed under low commodity prices and opposition from local communities. Yet the prospect remains. Should global conditions swing toward higher demand, Canada's ability to move hydrocarbons through its own Arctic corridors ensures it could reach markets independently. Territorial budgets rely heavily on royalties from existing projects, and any expansion of offshore drilling would reshape fiscal capacity in the north. That possibility, however, brings volatility. Prices fluctuate, and investments made during high-price periods often look costly when markets dip. The North's future as an energy supplier remains conditional, not inevitable. Infrastructure development continues to act as both enabler and reward in this process. Facilities built for resource projects or shipping serve dual functions as community assets. A port constructed for mineral exports also lowers food delivery costs. An extended airstrip used by exploration crews doubles as an emergency lifeline for residents. Communication towers raised to monitor navigation processes deliver internet to households. These improvements rarely dominate national statistics, but are transformative for cost of living in remote settlements. Residents note tangible quality of life benefits when supply costs fall, when medical evacuations arrive faster, or when digital services connect them to southern markets. Technology integration increases these efficiencies further. Satellite communication systems now provide links where analog radios once carried patchy signals. GPS-supported tracking improves navigation through ice-covered regions, reducing insurance costs and investor uncertainty. Real-time cargo monitoring enables more seamless supply chains and links northern exports directly with global buyers. For investors, these developments lower the premium of remoteness that historically deterred them. For communities, the upgrades bring connectivity that narrows gaps with the rest of Canada. Combined, these trends frame a cautious but credible picture of economic momentum. By mid-century, planners note that if shipping seasons lengthen further and infrastructure investment continues at current pace, the Canadian Arctic could develop into a major economic hub. The condition built into that forecast matters. Regional variability, environmental change, and the volatility of global markets all remain decisive. What can be said with greater confidence is that the Arctic's share of national growth is increasing year by year. Activity that once appeared experimental has settled into reproducible patterns. Shipping seasons still vary, but local institutions now prepare for them as annual features, not rare exceptions. The symbolism of this transformation should not be overlooked. For generations, many Canadians viewed the North primarily as a fiscal burden, distant communities subsidized by the South against severe odds of self-sufficiency. In 2025, shipping convoys escorted through the Northwest Passage by Canadian icebreakers tell a different story. The Arctic contributes not by lowering expectations, but by demonstrating tangible participation in trade and resources. Local ownership, as demonstrated by the Arctic Gateway Group in Churchill, underscores how communities themselves have become actors shaping this future, rather than audiences to federal programs. Foreign investors are watching. Asian shipping firms, European energy companies, and global mining groups continue to express interest in participating in northern projects, encouraged by Canadian regulatory stability and data showing longer open water seasons. These partnerships carry benefits, but also risks. Without careful frameworks, capital could flow outward while communities are left with limited returns. Canada's recent Arctic policy emphasizes the importance of equitable benefit sharing and Indigenous involvement for this reason. Economic growth cannot be sustained on external contracts alone. It must translate into training, employment, and services accessible to residents in the territories. Indigenous leaders insist that without such measures, development risks repeating the historic cycles of extraction without local prosperity. Social equity remains an inseparable dimension of economic planning. Gains in shipping and resource output are distributed unevenly, with some communities seeing infrastructure upgrades and others experiencing only environmental disruption. Policy debates increasingly stress revenue sharing, on-site training programs, and community-led environmental standards. These demands align with national strategy. Ottawa frames sovereignty not just in terms of patrolling waters, but also in demonstrating it governs them responsibly. A thriving, locally supported economic system shows the world that Canada does more than claim jurisdiction, it exercises it. In the numbers recorded today, the story is still in its early chapters. Relative to Canada's total GDP, the contribution of Northern Territories remains limited, but the trajectories stand out. Population inching upward after decades of stagnation, shipping revenues registering year after year instead of vanishing between escort trials, and mineral exports moving through Arctic corridors rather than solely through southern detours. These are the signs of a region shifting from peripheral to integrated, even if its precise role decades from now remains dependent on choices made in the present. The pace and scope of Canada's Arctic economic future remain uncertain, but what is clear is that economics cannot be separated from strategy. Every shipment through the passage, every agreement forged at northern ports, and every investment in territorial infrastructure builds both prosperity and precedent. In that sense, the Arctic is shaping not just livelihoods, but Canada's standing among nations. How this outcome is perceived, whether as proof of sustainable development or as grounds for rivalry, will be defined not only by Ottawa's ambition, but by how others interpret its rise. Canada's Arctic push in 2025 leaves three clear takeaways. First, infrastructure and governance. Ottawa is building capacity through the National Shipbuilding Strategy, with Polar Max under construction and international collaboration in the Ice Pact anchoring long-term capability. Second, climate and access. The record-low winter sea ice maximum in 2025 shows rapid change, but variability means navigation remains unpredictable. Third, geopolitics. The contest now involves Canada, Russia, and China, while friction with the United States over sovereignty lingers as a managed dispute. The stakes are simple. This shift matters because the Northwest Passage could reshape global trade and geopolitics. Which risk do you think matters most? Sovereignty, environment, or great power competition? Share your perspective in the comments and join the discussion below.